In the vast, sprawling tapestry of human existence, there are threads left loose, stories without an ending. These are the cold cases, chilling enigmas of lost souls and missing persons that linger in the public consciousness, haunting families and communities for years, sometimes decades. They are tales of uncertainty, of questions that echo in empty rooms, of a grief suspended in time, unable to find the solace of closure. But time, the great obscurer, can also be an agent of revelation. With the relentless march of technology and the unwavering dedication of investigators who refuse to let the trail go cold, the impossible can become possible. Before we dive in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe only if you truly enjoy exploring these stories with me, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your clock. It's always amazing to see our community connecting across the world. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's unravel tonight's haunting journey together. Case file number 1. The case of Amore Joe V. Wiggins. The story begins on a cold, bleak day in Opelika, Alabama. It was January 28, 2012. Winter had laid its gray hand over the landscape. Near the Brookhaven Trailer Park on Hurst Street, a local resident, perhaps out for a walk or simply taking a shortcut, stumbled upon something that shattered the day's quiet monotony: a human skull. The initial shock gave way to a grim procedure. Police officers descended on the scene, their boots crunching on the cold ground. A wider, more meticulous inspection of the area revealed a tragedy scattered in pieces. More skeletal remains were discovered, dispersed by time and the elements. Not far from a creek bank, investigators found another clue: a small, heart-wrenching artifact, a pink, long-sleeved shirt, adorned with delicate, heart-shaped buttons. It was a garment for a little girl, but police couldn't be certain if it belonged to the victim. It hung in the air as a poignant, unanswered question. Detectives and forensic anthropologists began the arduous task of giving a face to the formless. The skull, they concluded, belonged to a young African-American girl, likely between the tender ages of 4 and 7. The bones told a silent, horrific story of their own. A deformity in her left eye socket suggested she may have been a victim of physical abuse. Further examination revealed signs of severe malnourishment and neglect. This was not a child who was loved and cared for. This was a child who had suffered. In an effort to jog public memory, forensic artists painstakingly created a composite image, a rendering of what the little girl might have looked like. Her face, full of potential life, stared out from posters and news reports, a ghost seeking a name. Investigators pored over school enrollment lists and birth records, but it was as if she had never officially existed. She was a phantom, and so she was given a placeholder name, one that signified both her location and her mystery: Opelika Jane Doe. For 4 long years, the case file grew thicker with reports, but no closer to a solution. The girl's image remained, a silent plea for recognition. Then, in 2016, a flicker of hope emerged from the most unexpected of places. A teacher at a vacation Bible school at the Greater Peace Church, located just a 10-minute drive from where the remains were found, was looking through old photographs. She stopped at one. The picture, taken in the summer of 2011, showed a little girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to the forensic sketch of Opelika Jane Doe. The teacher's memories, hazy but persistent, began to surface. She recalled the girl vividly. She was about 4 or 5 years old at the time. Her hair was often disheveled, and her hygiene was poor. She was painfully shy, reclusive even, seemingly unable or unwilling to communicate and play with the other children. The teacher couldn't remember her name. The church, in a devastating oversight, had failed to register the children who attended that summer program. There were no records, no names, no way to trace her. Working with this single grainy photograph, police employed advanced imaging software to enhance it, sharpening the details of the little girl's face, praying that someone, somewhere, would finally recognize her. The investigation took another leap forward in 2017. Experts from the University of South Florida's Institute for Forensic Anthropology performed sophisticated isotope tests on her bones. This cutting-edge science analyzes chemical signatures in the remains to determine geographic origins based on diet and water consumption. The results suggested that she had likely lived most of her short, tragic life in the southeastern United States. The net was tightening, but her identity remained elusive. The final key to unlocking the mystery arrived in January 2022. The Opelika Police Department, refusing to give up, enlisted the help of Othram Inc., a private laboratory in Texas, specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram scientists are pioneers, capable of extracting usable DNA profiles from evidence that is degraded, contaminated, or, as in this case, decades old. They received the skeletal remains of Opelika Jane Doe and began their groundbreaking work. From a tiny fragment of bone, they managed to build a comprehensive genealogical profile. This profile was then handed to one of the most renowned figures in the field, Dr. Barbara Ray Venter. A genetic genealogist and retired patent attorney, Ray Venter is legendary in law enforcement circles, most famously for her instrumental role in identifying the Golden State Killer. She began the painstaking process of building a family tree for the unknown girl, using public DNA databases to find distant cousins and reverse engineer her lineage. Finally, in January 2023, after a decade of mystery, the moment of revelation came. Dr. Ray Venter and Othram had found her. Opelika Jane Doe had a name. She was Amore Jovi Wiggins. The identification immediately led investigators to her father, a 50-year-old Opelika native named Lamar Bickerstaff. At the time, Lamar was an active duty member of the U.S. Navy. Detectives traveled to the Mayport Naval Station in Jacksonville, Florida, where he was stationed. When confronted with the news of his long-lost daughter and her grim fate, Lamar was uncooperative, refusing to answer questions. His wife, Ruth Bickerstaff, whom he had married in 2006, claimed to have no knowledge of Amore. She told investigators she didn't know who the little girl was or who her biological mother might be. But the investigation pressed on, uncovering a hidden family history. Amore's biological mother was a woman named Sherry Wiggins, originally from Maryland. Sherry had met Lamar Bickerstaff when she was just 19 years old. He was 35 and serving in the Navy. They lived in the same apartment complex, and their relationship quickly progressed. When Sherry became pregnant with Amore, the couple considered marriage, but Lamar's family was reportedly furious that their son was having a child out of wedlock. The pressure was too great, and the couple split. When detectives located Sherry, now 37, she confirmed she was Amore's mother. She provided the final, heartbreaking pieces of the puzzle. She told them that in 2009, Lamar and his new wife, Ruth, had been granted full legal and physical custody of Amore. Sherry had been paying child support to Lamar ever since, but her visitation rights had been suspended around the time of Amore's death. She had been tragically and completely cut off from her daughter's life. On January 17, 2023, Lamar and Ruth Bickerstaff were arrested in Jacksonville. Both were charged with felony murder, failure to report a missing child, and child abuse. The charges painted a damning picture of their culpability in the suffering and death of the little girl they were supposed to protect. In the wake of the arrests, Sherry Wiggins spoke out publicly. She described the agony of the past decade and the complex emotions she now faced. While many in the community offered kindness and support, others were quick to judge her, blaming her for a situation they didn't understand. But through it all, Sherry's focus remained singular. "The only thing I'm worried about," she said, her voice heavy with grief and resolve, "is getting justice for Amore." She expressed her immense gratitude to the Opelika Police Department, the detectives who, for over 10 years, never forgot the little girl with no name. Case file number 2. The case of Noli Trice and Brian Lashley. The night of August 10th, 2017, was alive with the sounds of a party at a home in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Inside, Noli Renee Trice, 26, and her boyfriend, Brian Keith Lashley, 29, were hosting friends. It was a typical evening of socializing and relaxing. But as the night faded and the early morning hours of August 11th arrived, the home fell silent. It was a silence that masked an unspeakable horror. Later that morning, someone entered the house and discovered a scene of carnage. Noli and Brian were dead, their bodies lifeless amidst evidence of a brutal struggle. Blood was splattered throughout the residence. When officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department arrived, they were met with a chaotic and violent crime scene. Investigators began the meticulous process of piecing together the victim's final hours. They learned about the party and started questioning family members and guests. As forensic teams analyzed the home, one piece of evidence stood out: Noli's cell phone, found discarded in a hallway. In a world of digital footprints, a victim's phone can be a treasure trove of information. But this time, it was the physical object itself that held the key. Law enforcement personnel carefully processed the phone for fingerprints. As expected, Noli's prints were all over it. But there was another, unidentified fingerprint as well. Detectives ran the print through their databases, hoping for a match. They initially suspected it might belong to Brian, but the system returned a different name: Dustin Neal, an old acquaintance of the couple. When questioned, Neal was calm. He admitted he had known Noli for about 20 years and had been at the party. He claimed that after the party, he went directly to his mother's house. But then, he revealed something intriguing, perhaps a little too eagerly. He told police he was aware that the couple was in possession of 3 pounds of marijuana, which, in his own words, was worth a lot of money. He had planted a motive, but with no other evidence directly linking him to the murders, police had to let him go. The case went cold, and for years, it seemed the killer of Noli and Brian would never be found. But secrets, especially those of a violent crime, rarely stay buried forever. They fester, and often, the perpetrator's own pride becomes their undoing. In June 2017, just days after the murders, a person came forward to say they had received a call from a very agitated Dustin Neal, who claimed he had a large quantity of marijuana he was desperate to sell. It was a strong piece of circumstantial evidence, but not enough for an arrest. The case remained dormant until July 2022, when a second witness contacted police. This person revealed that Dustin Neal's own half-brother had told them that Dustin was responsible for what happened to Noli and Brian. Acting on this powerful new lead, authorities interviewed the half-brother in October of that year. He confessed what he knew. He had personally heard Dustin bragging about killing the young couple. The floodgates had opened. That same month, yet another witness came forward, claiming that Dustin had not only confessed to them about killing Noli and Brian, but it also boasted of being responsible for the deaths of 5 other people. Dustin Neal, it seemed, couldn't stop talking about his crimes. With this wealth of witness testimony, police obtained a warrant to analyze Neal's cell phone records from the time of the murders. The digital ghost of his location data told the final damning story. Between 6:20 a.m. and 7:04 a.m. on the morning of the murders, his cell phone signal was pinging off towers that placed him directly at or in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene. The full picture was now horrifyingly clear. In a poorly conceived plan to steal the marijuana he knew was in the house, Neal had entered the home through a window, believing it to be empty. But he was wrong. He was confronted by Brian Lashley. Panicked, Neal lunged at Brian with a knife, murdering him. To eliminate the only witness, he then turned the knife on Noli Trice. On January 1st, 2023, armed with an ironclad case built from fingerprints, witness testimony, and cell phone data, officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department and the Allen County Sheriff's Department arrested 35-year-old Dustin Neal. After nearly 6 long years of silence, the man who thought he had committed the perfect crime was finally brought to justice, his downfall orchestrated by his own arrogant boasts. Case file number 3, The Kind Neighbor. The case of Wilhelmina Filkins. Wilhelmina Violet Filkins was the heart of her small community in East Greenbush, New York. At 81 years old, she was a woman who radiated life. After retiring, she filled her days with 2 passions: tending to her beloved garden and doing volunteer work. She had lived in East Greenbush for 60 years, a fixture in the town, having grown up in neighboring Rensselaer with her 9 siblings. She had never married and lived a quiet, independent life alone in her apartment. On August 19, 1994, this peaceful existence was brutally shattered. Violet's brother and niece planned to visit her. As they pulled up to her multi-building apartment complex, they noticed her car, a 1989 Plymouth Reliant, was parked in its usual spot. But something was off. It was parked at an odd angle, not at all with the characteristic neatness of Violet. A small detail, but one that sparked a feeling of unease. Intrigued and a little worried, they went inside the building and let themselves into Violet's home. They were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Their vibrant, beloved sister and aunt was lying lifeless on her apartment floor. An autopsy later revealed that Violet had been assaulted 2 days prior to the discovery of her body. The cause of death was determined to be severe trauma to the head. Law enforcement theorized that the assailant had likely confronted her during a robbery. This hypothesis gained traction when it was discovered her car had been stolen, only to be returned later that same day, explaining the unusual way it had been parked. 3 years later, a bag containing some of Violet's personal possessions were found near the Nassau Shodak Cemetery, about 10 miles from her home, another frustrating clue that led nowhere. Despite an extensive investigation and numerous leads, police failed to identify a viable suspect. As the years turned into decades, Violet's case went cold, a shocking act of violence that remained a scar on the quiet town. Then, in 2019, 25 years after the murder, the case was jolted back to life by a single phone call. A woman contacted investigators with a chilling story. She said that her boyfriend had once confessed to her. His words, dripping with a belated and useless guilt, had haunted her for years. That poor old woman. I robbed her, I hit her, and I just left her there. The boyfriend's name was Jeremiah James Govett. Investigators immediately pulled the old case files. Govett's name was there. He had been a local teenager, just 18 years old at the time of the crime, and had been questioned as part of the initial sweep of the neighborhood. However, he had been subsequently ruled out as a suspect. After graduating from high school, Govett had left town, enlisting in the U.S. Air Force. After his discharge, he returned to New York, eventually settling in Rosendale. In a gut-wrenching twist of irony, the man who had murdered an elderly woman had found a job working as a bus driver for senior citizens. On October 1st, 2019, law enforcement officers arrived at Govett's home. Now 46, he was questioned about the 1994 murder of Wilhelmina Filkins. He instantly became defensive and visibly agitated, refusing to speak without an attorney. The next day, as police were continuing to interview his family and colleagues, Jeremiah Govett was found dead. He had taken his own life. Just before his death, he had made a frantic phone call to a family member, sounding terrified and distressed, reportedly saying that he didn't want to go to jail. Govett's suicide left investigators with a dead suspect, but, as of yet, no definitive proof. They needed a forensic link. They turned their attention back to the original crime scene evidence. On a wooden corner of a coffee table in Violet's apartment, crime scene technicians in 1994 had lifted a single, unidentified, latent fingerprint. For 25 years, that print had no match. Now, investigators compared it to fingerprints taken from Govett. The result was unequivocal. The fingerprints were one and the same. On January 19, 2023, the East Greenbush Police Department held a press conference. They announced that the case was officially closed. Jeremiah James Govett was the man responsible for the brutal murder of Wilhelmina Filkins. At the news conference, Violet's niece spoke, expressing her family's profound appreciation for the investigators who never gave up. She remembered her aunt not for the violence of her death, but for the beauty of her life, a humble woman who lived peacefully and spread nothing but joy and kindness to everyone she met. Case file number 4. The date was March 13, 1973. On the muddy banks of the Saginaw River in what is now the city of Zilwaukee, Michigan, a grim discovery was made. The body of a man had been pulled from the cold, murky water. An autopsy quickly revealed this was no accident. The man had sustained multiple gunshot wounds and injuries from blunt force trauma. The evidence suggested a brutal execution. He had been struck on the back of the head, then shot, and his body unceremoniously dumped in the river. The investigation hit an immediate and insurmountable wall. The man had no identification, and in 1973, without modern forensic tools, there was no way to determine who he was. With no identity and no clues as to who could have committed such a violent act, the case went cold almost as soon as it opened. The unknown man was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, his name and his killer lost to history. For nearly 50 years, he was a ghost, a John Doe in a forgotten file. The world moved on, but the injustice of his unsolved murder remained. In 2020, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Team, in conjunction with their Missing Persons Coordination Unit, reopened the case. They believed that modern science could finally break the half-century of silence. The man's body was exhumed, and a bone sample was sent to Othram Forensics for genetic genealogy testing. Working with the DNA Doe Project, by late 2021, a possible familial match was identified. The genealogical trail led investigators from Michigan all the way to Beeville, Texas. In a collaborative effort between the Michigan State Police, the Texas Rangers, and the DNA Doe Project, they were able to connect the remains to a specific family and obtain DNA reference samples from living relatives. These samples were sent to an FBI lab for final comparison. On January 5, 2023, it was made official. The John Doe from the Saginaw River was identified as Daniel G. Garza Gonzalez, a Vietnam War veteran who was only 28 years old at the time of his murder. His story came flooding back. After serving his country in Vietnam, Daniel had returned to America. He had left his home in Fort Worth, Texas, heading north to Flint, Michigan, in search of work and a new beginning. It was a journey of hope that ended in a nightmare. He never made it to Flint, and he never made it back home. His family was left to wonder for 50 years what had become of him. While identifying Daniel was a monumental achievement, it represents only partial justice. His name has been restored, and his family finally knows his fate. But his killer, or killers, remain unknown. The Michigan State Police are now treating this as an active homicide investigation and are calling for anyone with information about Daniel's case, no matter how old or seemingly insignificant, to come forward and help solve the final piece of this 50-year-old puzzle. Case file number 5. The Man from the Sea. The case of Philip Kahn. On July 24, 2000, in the vast, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a body was discovered. A fishing vessel found the unidentified man floating 27 miles off the coast of Maine, near a fishing area known as the Grand Manan Banks. The Maine office of Chief Medical Examiner took on the case, performing an autopsy and collecting DNA and fingerprint samples in an effort to identify him. The samples were submitted to the FBI's national databases, but no matches were found. With no identification, the investigation stalled. Police had no new leads to pursue, and the case of the Grand Manan John Doe went cold. In 2019, nearly 2 decades later, the medical examiner's office enlisted the help of Parabon Nanolabs, another leading firm in the field of forensic genealogy, to see if they could build a profile from the preserved DNA. But in this instance, their efforts yielded no tangible results. A reminder that even this revolutionary science sometimes depends on the luck of finding a matching relative in public databases. The case remained cold until March 2022, when the Maine OCME held a meeting with representatives from the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division to discuss new, modernized technologies that had become available. It was decided to resubmit the man's fingerprints and dental records for a fresh analysis using these updated systems. In May 2022, after a thorough review by CJIS and further examination at the FBI laboratory, a hit came back. After 22 years, the man from the sea had a name. He was 84-year-old Philip Kahn, who had been reported missing from Las Vegas, Nevada, in July 2000. Investigators notified one of Philip's surviving family members, who was able to provide some context. Philip had left Las Vegas in July 2000 and had taken a flight that landed in New York. But how his body ended up floating in the Atlantic Ocean, 27 miles off the coast of Maine, remains a complete and baffling mystery. The resolution of his identity has only given rise to an even more perplexing puzzle. A final, strange chapter in the life of Philip Kahn that is yet to be solved. That concludes today's video. I truly hope this gave you valuable insight into some of the most overlooked cases throughout the years. If you found this helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications to stay updated. Thanks again for your time and support. There's more on the way, so stay tuned.